Hello, so I recently came across the channel Top Fives. That channel covers a lot of interesting rundowns, and I really like the guy's presentation skills. He's very good at the way he puts across the rundown. So usually things like lost cities, paranormal activities, unexplained photos, this sort of thing. It's a great channel, it deserves more views, so I would strongly recommend it. And I'm going to put a link on this channel to the video I'm referring to. So one of his latest videos is Titanic all-time conspiracy theories, or top conspiracy theories. I forget the exact title, but it's along those lines. Now, the RMS Titanic, without question, the most famous ship in the world. Here we have it up there in my poster. I've personally had an interest in the Titanic for pretty much my whole life. I'm from Belfast, which is of course where the ship was built, but over time, I've realized I've got some personal connections to the ship. I was born on the 1st of September 1985. That's exactly the same day that Robert Ballard rediscovered it at the bottom of the Atlantic. So that's a bit of a coincidence. Also, my grandparents live in a guest house in South Belfast. Now, that guest house at Ash Rowan was the very same house where Thomas Andrews lived for a time. I'm not sure if it was the same time that he was working on the Titanic project, but certainly not far off. He was originally from Cumber in County Down, but he did live for a while in Belfast, certainly when he was working on the Titanic project. So you could say my family has a bit of a personal connection there, as I understand it. I need to confirm this, but as I understand it, when James Cameron was making his blockbuster film, he stayed at the Ash Rowan, so that's quite something. So yeah, I've long had a personal interest in that. I love the film. Flawed as it is, it has some dubious points, but I still think it's the greatest film ever made, in my opinion. It has everything. I think it's an outstanding film. It blew me away, and yeah. So that's basically a bit of background with my own personal experience with the Titanic. Even before the big 1997 blockbuster, I always liked the old 1958 Night to Remember film, which is in that film they didn't realize that the ship had broken in two. That was something that Cameron touched on, and even in the Cameron film, he depicts the film as breaking in two above the surface, whereas when the Ballard expedition to the Atlantic discovered it, it was theorized that it broke in two as it was going down. So, without further ado, I'm going to discuss some of the conspiracy theories that are going on around the Titanic. Um, and this isn't going to be a deeply comprehensive video, it's just going to touch on some of the issues. But basically, if we look at some of the main theories that go against the popular narrative. So, what is the popular narrative? The popular narrative is the Titanic was going too fast, it struck an iceberg, and sank on its maiden voyage. Well, there's a few myths about the Titanic that need to be dispelled, and Top Fives helped to point out some of these things in his video. Number one, the Titanic's maiden voyage was not actually at the time the huge story that it is now thought to have been. Why? Because the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, had actually already made its maiden voyage and done, I think it was 5 transatlantic journeys. So the Titanic, in some ways, was seen as second best at this point. It's only after the sinking, in some ways, the Titanic became really as famous as it has become. That's not to say that it wasn't going to be famous, but I don't think it would be anywhere near as famous as it now is without the sinking. I think that goes without saying. So the Olympic had actually been the flagship of White Star Line. It was roughly the same size as Titanic, roughly the same tonnage, but it was in fact the flagship, not the Titanic. Now, one of the most popular theories is one that goes back quite a few years, and it is that there was a huge insurance scam and that there was a switchover of the nameplates on the two ships. What had actually happened was the Olympic had been involved in a collision that caused serious damage to its hull. There were no casualties, but the damage was so bad that the Olympic was going to be written off, and this would have basically bankrupted White Star Line. So there is a theory that some of the leading figures in White Star Line, such as John Bruce Ismay, possibly Thomas Andrews, and a few other figures, got involved in this huge plan to basically switch over the number plates, stage a sinking to collect the insurance, and basically save the company. Now this is really quite something. This is up there with claiming that 9/11 was an inside job. There's a few fundamental flaws with this theory, though. I mean, on one hand, one of the main supporting arguments is that the ships look virtually identical. If you look at the photographs, there's virtually nothing to distinguish them. So it could have been pulled off in that sense. Now, one of the main arguments against it, and this is something I happen to endorse, how on earth do you get 50,000 Belfast shipyard workers to stay silent on something like this? To switch over the number, the registration plates over a weekend would require a huge, huge cover up. And to get 50,000 shipyard workers to cover up on the wages that they had, I think is very implausible. Um, it seems very far fetched. Also, another big flaw in that argument is Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews were on the ship. Ismay survived, Thomas Andrews died. So it would be a big ask for them to be on a ship that they knew was going to be sabotaged. I think I think it's an interesting theory, but I think it's too far fetched because simply from the point of view, it would be far too hard to cover up. Now, a more recent theory, and I think it is a very intriguing theory, is that there was actually a fire on the ship as early as when it was in the dock in Belfast, or at least, in Belfast. If you look at the hull of the ship in some of those early photographs, there is a black bulge. Someone recently noticed this. Now, that wasn't shadows because the same bulge, the same sort of dark spot, appears in several photos. This indicates there may well have been a fire in the hull that they felt they had under control. Nevertheless, this is an incredibly reckless thing to do, to knowingly cover up a fire that was going on. But there is a backdrop to this. At the time, in 1911, 1912, there was a major coal strike going on in Britain. And obviously, when there's a coal strike, there is a threat to coal supplies, to steam a transatlantic liner. So there's a whole narrative around this fire and around this idea that there was actually a fire on board. So the actual reason the ship was perceived to be speeding wasn't to break any sort of record, but was, as I understand it, something to do with this fire on board. Now, whether that was to reach Halifax on time to put the fire out, it seems like an incredibly reckless thing, but they clearly felt, if this was true, that the fire wasn't so serious that it endangered the entire ship. However, when the iceberg struck the hull, the theory of this is that the iceberg itself didn't sink the Titanic, but that the iceberg weakened the metal foundations. This is again quite similar to the World Trade Center conspiracies about weakened metal and so on. It is quite interesting how you can see parallels there. Now, one of the most colourful theories is that there was an Egyptian pharaoh S on board that was cursed, namely Amun Ra. There's other theories about the Hope Diamond being on board. These theories are certainly very colourful. They make great conspiracy theories, but the big flaw in them is that there is simply no hard evidence that they were ever on board. There is a theory that there was an American curator who had bought this mummy from the Museum of Egypt in Cairo, but there's no documentation in the ship's cargo, which has been documented, that that was the case. But it certainly makes an interesting theory, almost as interesting as the diamond that was in Cameron's synopsis in his story, that was loosely based on the Hope Diamond. Um, so it's certainly very interesting. Unfortunately, it just has very, very little basis in fact. Um, so those are some of the main conspiracies that are out there. I think there's a few others. Yeah, I'll touch on one more. This isn't so much a conspiracy theory as a rumor, and that is that John Bruce Ismay, the chairman, of course, of White Star Line, a man who has been vilified by history, pressured Captain Smith to go fast in order to break a speed record and arrive in New York one day early. Now, this is something that has been repeatedly told in all the film versions and throughout all the Titanic narratives. Actually, there is not a great deal of basis for this. There was one passenger that claimed she overheard this. Certainly, Ismay was a bit of a flamboyant character, and I think he definitely is culpable for, partly culpable at least. He fought against the number of lifeboats on board. There were 48 lifeboats on board. Ismay thought that was too many, a grave mistake. So Ismay can rightly be criticised for that. But Captain Smith was an experienced veteran sea captain. It's difficult to believe that he would have been pushed around even by someone of Ismay's status. Um, Also, the Titanic never tried to break a speed record. No one involved thought about that because they knew it was impossible. The Titanic was not designed for speed, it was designed for luxury. And they knew that the Titanic, 46,000 tons of floating metal, of floating iron, wasn't going to break a speed record in the way a sailing ship would have. So that was never the initiative with the Titanic. Also, arriving in New York City one day early would have just been a big inconvenience for the port authorities. There is port protocol. New York City was a busy port. There was Ellis Island immigration. There was all sorts of things that would have absolutely been against the regulations of the sea. My father worked for 4 years in the port of Rotterdam. There's no way a ship, a captain, a company could do that without letting them know, without letting the port authority know in advance. All it would have done is cause a great deal of inconvenience for everyone. For everyone, for the passengers, for the crew, for the port authority. So that rules that out. So the Titanic was not trying to break a speed record. And finally, White Star Line itself did not actually advertise the Titanic as unsinkable. This is something that the tabloid press cooked up at the time. Certainly, they would have had promotional material for its luxury and so on, but it was never actually advertised as unsinkable. And what people need to bear in mind is that the yellow press then were just as sensationalist as they are today. And I'll close with this point. I did touch on this in a previous video, but I think it needs to be said again. And that is about Bruce Ismay. Now, Ismay, certainly I feel, is culpable partly for the sinking, culpable for unnecessary deaths in the sinking. His decision to fight against a number of lifeboats certainly was a disgrace, and he can rightly be criticised for that. Some would say Thomas Andrews can also be criticised for not fighting against Ismay's decision. However, the Titanic was not actually breaching safety standards of the time. As incredible as that sounds, the Titanic was only in standard of what every other ship of the day was doing. Um, So, in a sense, all the maritime companies of the time were equally guilty. There was a generally blasé attitude to safety at the time. The Titanic is known for it because of obviously what happened, but this is something that the Titanic wasn't actually exceptional in this regard. Um, Bruce Ismay has been vilified as a coward. Now, I feel this is somewhat unfair. The idea that a man of Bruce Ismay's position would have pushed past women and children is utterly absurd. And survivors actually testified that he helped other passengers get to lifeboats. And he personally dealt with the paperwork for hundreds of insurance claims. Now, Ismay can be criticised for his attitude prior to the sinking, and certainly he needs to bear some culpability given that he was the chairman of White Star Line. But I sometimes feel that he has been scapegoated as an individual. There are other people involved, like Lord Mersey, who completely exonerated White Star Line. Now, why is there not the same level of criticism levelled at Lord Mersey, as levelled at Bruce Ismay? Bruce Ismay was on the ship. His only crime, it seems to me, was surviving. Um, and it was the standards of the time, the fact that there were women and children who died. It was the code of chivalry of that time. Apparently, for the rest of his life, Bruce Ismay died in 1927, I believe, 1937. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland, living in humble abode, and basically mocked for the rest of his life as a coward. And I feel this is somewhat unfair. I do hope history starts to treat Ismay in a different light. And I hope if there's another Titanic film, there probably will be, that it shows Ismay in a slightly more sympathetic light. I feel that every film version has presented him as a coward. This isn't fair. He was actually ordered onto a lifeboat. Um, the idea that he pushed past women and children is a complete smear, and there's no basis in fact. I think that was something cooked up by the tabloids at the time. No one has claimed that. Not a single survivor of the sinking itself actually said Bruce Ismay pushed past women and children. Did get on a lifeboat. This because he was ordered by an officer to do so, and as a civilian passenger, he had to follow that. He couldn't fight against it. So those are a few things to think about. Let me know your thoughts. Do you have any ideas about these conspiracy theories? And I will put a link to the very interesting video by Top Fives. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts.